much of my mother has my mother left in me? How much of my love will be insane to some degree? And what about this feeling that I'm never good enough? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? How much like my father am I destined to become? Will I kill the light inside me just to satisfy someone? Or will I let this woman kill me, or do away with jealous love? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? I can't feel the love I want, I can't feel the love I need, but it's never gonna come the way I am. Could I change it if I wanted? Could I rise above the flood? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? How much like my brothers do my brothers wanna be? Will another broken home become a broken family? Or will we be there for each other like nobody ever could? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? I can't feel the love I want, I can't feel the love I need, but it's never gonna come the way I am. Could I change it if I wanted? Could I rise above the flood? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? Oh, I can't feel the love I want, I can't feel the love I need, but it's never gonna come the way I am. Could I change it if I wanted? Could I rise above the flood? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? Oh, 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 I can't feel the love I want, I can't feel the love I need, but it's never gonna come the way I am. Could I change it if I wanted? Could I rise above the flood? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood?
Okay, thanks for joining. My name is Jason Silo, and I'm a television producer, film producer, and I live here in New York City now, but I'm excited to tell you about Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut from about 1971, 72, and I left to move into New York in 1995. Before I get started, though, I want to point out that song you just heard was written by John Mayer, who is also from Connecticut. He grew up in Fairfield County with his brothers, who he references in that song. And that's an indication of kind of the variety of talent that comes from the state of Connecticut. And so this account, I'm not a historian, but I had a very probably typical Connecticut childhood through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so this is going to be kind of a personal account of growing up in Connecticut during that time frame through my experiences in different parts of the state. And hopefully that will give you a picture of life in Connecticut, which I don't think is very different now from the time when I grew up there. What's unique about Connecticut is it's on the eastern seaboard, obviously, of the United States. And we are in some ways defined by the states that surround us, because to our south, we have New York City primarily, and that is a big pull for the southern part of the state. A lot of people live in Connecticut and commute to jobs in New York City via the train system. And so this lower part of the state that you're looking at on this map of Connecticut can be suburban communities feeding into New York City. So there's a lot of back and forth between New York and Connecticut and the southern part of the state. And on the northern part of the state, up where you see the word Connecticut on this slide, we have Massachusetts that borders us. And I think Connecticut is different in the sense that both New York and Massachusetts have very identifiable accents, regional accents. The way they speak English has a very distinct accent in Massachusetts and in New York. But in Connecticut, we don't really have that. Connecticut is not a place that really has as defined a personality as some of the other states that surround it, but we are very much a New England state. And we have 4 seasons, which is a big part, I think, of growing up in Connecticut, because the activities that you participate in have to do with the seasons. As you can see, we have the Atlantic Ocean surrounding one half of the state. So going to the beach in the summer, fishing, traveling by boat to various places is a big part of summer activities there. And in the winter, we have access to skiing and a lot of winter sports that people participate in, both in Connecticut and in the surrounding New England states, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. The industries that have historically driven the economy in Connecticut would be primarily healthcare, aerospace and defense industries, the insurance industry, and education in the form of some of the large universities that are predominant in Connecticut. Most notably, we have Yale University in New Haven, and we have UConn, which is a men's college basketball and women's college basketball powerhouse, which is up in Hartford, which is in the north part of the state. So Connecticut, by the waterside and on the coasts, is more suburban. I would say as you move north and west to the state, it gets much, much more rural. There's farming up in the northwest corner of Connecticut. And Connecticut people in general are not a showy or ostentatious people. They are Connecticut Yankees is the term. They sort of are an unfussy, straight ahead kind of people who don't put on airs or have many opinions. And we're not a state that people have strong opinions about. I think that's one of the aspects of Connecticut. So let me go to my next slide here. So to place things in context a little bit for Connecticut, as I said, Connecticut is part of New England, and as a state, it was founded in the 1600s, so about 1630, 1635. And the early settlers who founded Connecticut actually came from Massachusetts, and they were seeking more land, religious freedoms, a lot of the things that motivated travel and relocation within the founding colonies. It's largely a rural and suburban state, and I think that the kind of individual cultures are really based around the towns. So different characteristics depending on which town, which part of Connecticut that you're in. As I mentioned, we really have these two anchoring cities. You have New Haven to the south, and you have Hartford to the north. These are only about 45 minutes from each other, but they are kind of worlds apart in terms of the things that go on there, the activities, the culture. Hartford is a fairly large city that has skyscrapers and was the center of the insurance industry in the United States for a long time. It has a number of universities. And New Haven is a more diverse city that has Yale University, Quinnipiac College, University of New Haven. It is home to wildly different economic subsets of the population. It's much more a city that has a ebb and flow with New York City to its south, because from New Haven to get to New York City by train really won't take you very long at all. Maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes on the Metro North. Most of the residents in Connecticut, I think, live in these towns and suburbs. And then the four-season climate, as I mentioned, is a big part of kind of how life in Connecticut transpires. To tell you a little bit about my roots and family here in Connecticut and how we came to be there is somewhat representative, because I think this is part of the foundation of Connecticut and part of what continues to make Connecticut kind of unique. I was actually born in Tennessee and returned to live with my extended family in New Haven, Connecticut, when I was 3 years old. My mother's family has really deep roots in Connecticut. They're originally from England, but they were in Connecticut by the early 1800s. And my grandparents on my mother's side were actually born in New Haven around 1900. My grandfather on my mother's side resided in Hamden, Connecticut, which is a slide I'm going to talk about in a forthcoming bit here. But Hamden is a suburb of New Haven, and my grandfather ran the corner drugstore, the pharmacy. And at that time in the mid-1900s, that was really part of the fabric of the community, was the drugstore. Everybody came and went from the drugstore, whether it was picking up their medications, hearing local gossip, purchasing staples for the home. It was like the centerpiece of downtown life in a typical suburban American town. And my grandfather, Charlie Crook's drugstore, was no exception. So my mom and all of her siblings grew up in Hamden, attended the local high schools in Hamden. On my father's side, it's completely different. They were Carpatho-Rusins, and my paternal grandfather was born in Czechoslovakia in 1904. They immigrated to the United States sometime in the 1920s, 1930s, and had settled in the Lower East Side of New York City, with many immigrants of the time, and that retains a character in that part of New York to this day. So this kind of core geography for my life, Hamden, New Haven, and then later on other towns like West Haven, Westport, these are all a short drive from each other, but they're very different from each other. And that's part of, I think, the makeup and the geography of Connecticut, is that it's not a very big state. You could drive completely from one end of Connecticut to the other, certainly in less than 2.5 hours. But in that drive, you'll pass through so many different ways to live and so many different types of places to live, whether it's cities, farms, apartment complexes. There's a lot of differentiation between places in Connecticut that are very close to each other. So that's just a little bit about where my Connecticut roots stem from. Going to this next slide, in Hamden, Connecticut, this is a picture of a mountain and a recreational area in Connecticut that's called Sleeping Giant. And you can see that it's called Sleeping Giant because it looks like a giant who is lying down and sleeping. And this was just in our backyard when my mother and I relocated to Hamden from New Haven, where we had moved when I was 3. And we lived in an apartment complex here. It was a small one. It had maybe 4 or 5 units, and they were kind of 2-story townhouse apartments. And I lived here in Hamden from the time I was 3 or 4 years old through the time I was about 8 years old, going to kindergarten and elementary school. And Hamden was a very quiet, very semi-rural town, very close to this park, which is, really in our backyard. We had train tracks behind our apartment complex that you could walk along. There was a local ice cream parlor in the winter. There was sledding and playing in the snow. And our neighbors were people who worked at local universities or worked jobs in New Haven or other larger cities and towns. So it was kind of a small and contained world with pretty good schools and a very Connecticut kind of way of life, I think, that I think, in thinking back on it, is very typical of a lot of the suburban towns in Connecticut. Are kind of self-contained in a way. They have their own main streets. They have their own schools. I think there's something like 250 different school districts in Connecticut for kids to attend local public schools. So it's this kind of together but individual collection of towns and cities that makes Connecticut maybe not have such a central unified personality that you could maybe identify with other states. If you say, well, I'm from Texas, people have a whole host of associations with that are probably largely true, although there is certainly a tremendous amount of differentiation and diversity in a state as big as Texas. But if you say you're from Connecticut, I don't think anyone really has an association with that, except one that I'll talk about in a minute, which isn't necessarily a truthful one, but it's something that people think they think about Connecticut, which is actually referencing only a very small part of the state. And that's really Fairfield County, which I mentioned earlier in relation to that song by John Mayer that opened this presentation. That is definitely one aspect of Connecticut that, if people think something about Connecticut, I think that's what they tend to think of. They think, oh, everybody's really wealthy who lives in Connecticut, which is certainly not true. Like any state, it has a tremendous amount of differentiation between all of the various towns and the ways of living. The next stop in my journey growing up in Connecticut was to leave Hamden, which, as I said, was kind of a very rural and very self-contained place, moving a little bit closer down to the southern part of the state in New York City. And this is when my mom and I relocated to West Haven, which is a very different experience than Hamden, Connecticut, and really only 10 or 15 minutes away, but so completely different. This was a much more working class, blue collar town. And it's a town that's on what we call the Long Island Sound. So it's not technically the Atlantic Ocean, because if you're standing on the shoreline here at West Haven and you're looking out at this body of water, what you actually can see on a far shore is the westernmost coast of Long Island, part of New York. And so there's a body of water between Long Island and between Connecticut, which is called the Long Island Sound. And it's not quite the Atlantic Ocean, but the Atlantic Ocean certainly feeds that. So that's kind of a differentiator in a way, in that West Haven is not on the Atlantic Ocean the way places in the Hamptons, which maybe people have heard of as, one of the more luxurious locations to live in Long Island, and right on the Atlantic Ocean, this beautiful seacoast. That's not what we have here in West Haven. We're on the Sound, so we don't really have waves. We don't really have the type of marine life that you would have in the ocean. West Haven was a place where you had a lot of multi-generational families. There's a lot of ethnic families living in West Haven, a lot more kind of visible social struggles and difficulties going on, but a very normalized suburban life and my teenage life there was about having part-time jobs, and your daily life when you're not in school would be centered on going down to the beach. In the winter, we would go skating on ponds, play hockey. We would ride bikes everywhere. That's the main way that we would get around both West Haven and then maybe sometimes jaunt further out. But really, we never really left West Haven very much. We would go to the mall, which was in a surrounding town. But you had to have someone drive you. Your mom had to drop you off and pick you up. So a lot of the daily life in West Haven tended to kind of situate right in West Haven, for better, for worse. And the time that I was growing up here was in the early 80s. And this is when MTV came around, I think in 82, 83. And that was a big part of the social life in West Haven, Connecticut, going to the movies. And I mentioned in the winter, we did have some ski hills. I wouldn't call them mountains because they're really essentially hills that you could ski down, maybe 400 or 500 or 600 feet. But night skiing was a big thing in Connecticut when I grew up. And it's something that happens at some ski resorts, but most people have had no experience going skiing at night, which to them seems kind of like a crazy activity. But to those of us who grew up in Connecticut in the 80s and the 90s, that's just what you did. You went night skiing. You went to high school. High school kids, if they got together or had parties, they were happening outside, like in the woods somewhere or down at the beach. They were not taking place in people's homes traditionally because we had this coastline here that was accessible to us. West Haven, in a way, is one of those towns where you either stay, and when I grew up, a lot of the kids that I was in elementary school and high school with, their parents had also grown up in West Haven and had also gone to elementary and high school in West Haven. And many of them still live in West Haven. So there would be the third or fourth generation of people to grow up in this town, remain in this town, oftentimes following their parents into the lines of work that their parents had. And so in that sense, it's a traditional kind of community that has pretty strong ties to itself. But for some of us, it became kind of something to escape or get away from if our ambitions were maybe a little bigger than the world of West Haven, which was pretty small unto itself. So for those of us who didn't feel like we really belonged there or had bigger aspirations, you started looking elsewhere. And you started to look at places incrementally a little bit closer to New York City, because New York City, if you're growing up in West Haven or New Haven, can feel still like a very foreign country in a way. It feels so big and so massive to you when you're a kid growing up. Taking the train into New York, which we really did only infrequently, was a sense of the size and the scope of New York City feeling unmanageable and too big to navigate and too big to really understand. So that kind of fuels, the desire to get elsewhere. And I think getting elsewhere for me involved a town really just 10 or so minutes away from West Haven, which is called Westport, Connecticut. And Westport, Connecticut is part of this Fairfield County line that I mentioned. It includes towns like Greenwich, Connecticut, Westport, Fairfield. And these are wealthy towns. These are probably among the wealthiest, most expensive towns in Connecticut. At the time in the 80s and the 90s, they were still multi-generational in that people had grown up in Westport. Their parents had probably moved to Westport. So as like I said, in West Haven, if kids I went to school with were second or third generation West Haven residents, people in Westport, when I was spending time there, were probably second generation only. Their parents probably moved to Westport in order to work in New York City. And their parents probably worked at places like media, publishing, finance, advertising. These were people who had high paying college level jobs in New York City and would commute back and forth to Westport or Fairfield County. And I found my way there out of that sense of kind of an escape from West Haven and looking for a different type of family experience than I was able to have. This picture that I have here is Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, who were probably the most, I would say, famous residents of Westport, Connecticut, although there were many. We had Martha Stewart, Dave Letterman. I think Robert Redford also lived in this area. So there's a lot of movie stars, famous people. But the difference is that in Connecticut, this was not, you didn't make a fuss over things like this. You didn't really approach them in public, or the reason they were there was to get away from the notoriety that would follow them in a place like New York or Los Angeles, or more media-centric, more Hollywood-centric locations. And so I think they found a life and a pace of life in Connecticut, particularly, that suited them and that still allowed them to be close to work in New York City, and yet, have a real comfortable, almost rural life, because there was quite big parcels of land, large homes. The Newmans had several children. They had a house right on a river that ran in their backyard where Paul Newman would swim every morning. And so Westport and Fairfield County in general are considered, I think, the things that people think about if they think about Connecticut. But it's really only one small part of Connecticut. And I think it's useful to think that it's talked about and amplified perhaps because of things like this, that it has this history of interesting people involved in the arts and finance and industry kind of living there. Now, this has all really changed in the last 20 years. A lot of that business is gone. A lot of it has changed in remote work, where people don't have to be located so close to New York City any longer. And so you have a different kind of group of people that are coming in and buying these old homes and renovating them and turning them over and living now in Fairfield County. So that's probably one of the areas that, given that it's what we would call like a bedroom community to New York City, meaning you can commute there from your job in New York, sleep and live there, and then get back on the train and go to work the following morning. Those types of communities, in my experience, tend to turn over pretty generationally, so that if someone's parents grew up a certain way in one of these kind of towns, well, as the industry that supports those towns and provides those jobs changes, then other industries move in and other types of people move in who now have jobs that are taking place within proximity to a place like Westport, Connecticut. And so it's an interesting but very different aspect of Connecticut, and it's really something that isn't repeated really anywhere else in the state. This band that is really close to New York City in proximity is pretty unique, and that proximity drives who lives there, and the turnover may mean that it doesn't have some of those generational roots that many other parts of Connecticut will have going back many, many generations, many more than the generations I mentioned, where, my grandparents, people have, 4 or 5 or 6 generations in certain parts of Connecticut working in the similar industries or running a family farm or whatever it might be. Inevitably, I think if you're someone who grew up in Connecticut and you have ambitions beyond living and working in your hometown, maybe doing the same thing that your parents were doing, really you're inevitably going to be pulled and end up in New Haven, Connecticut as the next stop of your journey, probably before you then leave the state and go to someplace like New York City, or a much larger city in another state. And New Haven is a great city. I'm a big advocate for New Haven. I always have been. It was very formative in my life. And it has a lot of interesting aspects to it that make it really a very unique place to have been a teenager and to have spent, part of my 20s in. And obviously, one of the most notable aspects of New Haven is Yale University. You can see the campus of Yale University here in this slide. And Yale obviously is such a massive institution globally. It draws students from all over the world. It has museums. It has concert halls. It has a law school. I mean, it has everything. It has athletic fields. And it has a very large and looming presence in New Haven. But it is not New Haven. It's not the totality of New Haven. It's one part of New Haven. And I titled this slide Town versus Gown because that's a thing you hear a lot in the United States when you live in a college or university town. Because usually that college or university is probably the only reason most outside people would even know of your town or your city. But if you're living in that town or the city, you kind of resent that because you feel that there's a lot more to your town or city than just this university or college. And we had that and still have that in New Haven. But it's a symbiotic relationship. You need both, and you have to have one to have the other. And the contribution that Yale makes to New Haven and the contribution that New Haven makes to Yale is part of what makes this tension also become a kind of synergy. And New Haven is what I would call a big little city in that it is not the downtown part of New Haven is something that you could walk within 20 minutes or a half hour before you start getting into some of the suburban, more residential neighborhoods that surround New Haven, but that are still part of New Haven. But the downtown part of New Haven, which is where Yale University is primarily located, it's where much of the infrastructure, the courthouses, police station, fire departments, restaurants, art galleries, clothing stores, bookshops, coffee shops, all of the life of a small city like New Haven. But because of the presence of Yale and because of the proximity to New York City, you also have culture, world-class culture that occurs and takes place in New Haven and is accessible to local residents. Maybe not quite as accessible as everyone would like, but it was certainly very accessible to us as teenagers growing up in New Haven in the 1980s. Our experience was we defined ourselves as townies. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with that term, but in the States, a townie is someone who grows up in a college town but is not affiliated with the college. You're a townie. And there's a certain status afforded to you as a townie, but you're not one of them. And you are maybe viewed a little carefully as a result. But in the 80s, what was amazing about growing up and spending time in New Haven was that you could have access to all of Yale University. You could go into these towers, like this spired tower that you see on this slide here is part of a residential college, a residential hall, which is where students would live. And you could just go in and go up the stairs and go to the very top of that tower and hang out and look out across the city. We had access to the library. We had access to the dining commons. We had access to the catacombs that were beneath the university. We could go to Cross Campus, which is a beautiful piece of lawn that all the students and faculty would hang out outside on a beautiful day. And so New Haven and Yale were very intertwined. Like there was a permeable barrier. And I think now, inevitably, Security is much tighter. Access is controlled. Technology is so different. Nowadays, you can't do any of that unless you are a student or a faculty member affiliated with the university. And I think I haven't lived in New Haven in a number of years, but I would imagine that harder barrier creates more of a sense of separation between the townies, the town versus the gown. They say gown because you wear a gown if you graduate university at Yale, so town versus gown. So it's possible that the barrier nowadays is a bit more strict, and it's probably to the detriment of both sides. But New Haven has everything, and in a good way, you are juxtaposed very almost street by street with very different economic realities, very different groups of people living in close proximity to each other. Not quite as much as the next stage when you're in New York City, but it's pretty close. For example, when I was spending time in New Haven in the 80s, a lot of my friends, their parents worked at Yale University or were university professors, so they lived just outside the downtown area in these beautiful, colonial homes. And then just over the hill, you could ride your bike there in 30 seconds or a minute. You had people that were living in city-run government housing, very different economic realities, like really close to each other. And so while there might be tensions related to that, there's also more of a sense at the time that everybody was all part of this community and all part of this fabric. And that's very much New Haven. New Haven is made up of a lot of disparate groups who are living and working in proximity to each other. And the culture of New Haven is not defined by Yale University by any stretch of the means, but it's certainly a big part of it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that American pizza, the best pizza in the world, not just the United States, not just New York City, not just Connecticut, the best pizza in the world is in New Haven, Connecticut. And if you ever find yourself in New Haven, Connecticut, you have to go to either one of three pizza parlors, as we call them. You have to go to Sally's, Pepe's, or Modern Pizza. And if you're not from New Haven, you say this to people and they look at you like you're crazy. How could this small city in Connecticut have the best pizza? It's just a fact. This is where American pizza was invented and perfected. And they cook the pizzas in either coal or wood-fired ovens. The recipes are closely protected and guarded. And as a child, it is part of your life growing up that your parents take you to one of these pizza places. Even if you live in West Haven or Hamden or Hartford, this is all centered in New Haven, on Worcester Street in New Haven, which is a very old Italian-American community that's part of New Haven. And I can't tell you much more about it other than you're going to have to try it for yourself and trust me when I say that New Haven has two main food claims to fame. The first one is the best pizza in the world. And yes, that does include Italy. The second is that the hamburger was invented in New Haven, Connecticut. And you can still go to the place right in downtown New Haven. I used to live right across the street. It's called Louie's Lunch. And I don't know the date, but a long, long time ago, Louis put hamburger between two pieces of toast and invented a machine that would cook the hamburger and then serve it to you on a piece of toast without cheese or ketchup. You cannot get cheese or ketchup on these hamburgers, and you don't need them. So Louie's Lunch is a must-do if you ever find yourself in New Haven. And personally, I would recommend that you go to Modern Pizza for the best of New Haven pizza. Other things having to do with New Haven are that I think you learn about the differences between all the different groups of people that assemble in a city like New Haven. I called it a big little city because we have everything that a city like New York would have, or Chicago, or Los Angeles. We have things like symphony orchestras. We have renowned playhouses. We have all of the culture that you would have in a major city. And we do have industry in New Haven. We have manufacturing, arms manufacturing. It's a big industry in New Haven. They're still active there and in Hartford. But it's a small location. So to this day, I think I have an affinity for cities like New Haven, Cleveland, Rochester, New York, big little cities that don't have the kind of presence of a New York City that can be somewhat overwhelming. It's all there and available to you, but in a manageable scale, in an affordable scale, you can afford to live there. The quality of life is excellent. You have access to all the recreational things that you could possibly want. And you have all of the culture of a place like New York City without any of the difficulties of living in a place like that. But of course, inevitably, the story of anyone who grew up in Connecticut in the 70s, the 80s, who has some aspirations to be a part of something that you can't really be a part of in Connecticut or in New Haven or in West Haven, is the move to New York. And I think this is almost a rite of passage for a lot of Connecticut youth and teenagers. And it's a big one. I remember being really afraid of the concept of making this move before I did it in 1995, because we would go to New York infrequently to go to a concert, but it always felt overwhelming. It was the scale of New York City compared to New Haven. I mean, it's 100-fold, it seemed to us. The confusion, the amount of people on the streets, it just was overwhelming. And so inevitably making the move to New York feels like a crazy leap of faith and kind of like something you probably shouldn't be doing, because how the hell are you going to make this work in a place like New York City? But of course, that's the brilliance of New York City. Whereas in Connecticut or in New Haven, you could probably live pretty easily finding yourself any type of available job. But in New York City, you have to kind of make it, or it's going to chew you up and spit you out. So that's a rite of passage that happens for a lot of us. And I think for me, it was about, I went to college in Massachusetts and then I returned to New Haven. I lived in New Haven for a few years. I worked a variety of different jobs. I worked at a law firm. And then I felt the pull of New York because I thought what I wanted to do was work in film and television. And that's not really an industry that you could do in Connecticut. Ironically, now, much easier. You can work in Stamford, Connecticut, which is another community kind of equidistant between between New Haven and New York City, has a huge television presence now. NBC has a huge studio there. World Wrestling is based out of Stamford, Connecticut. There's a lot of media in Connecticut. ESPN is based up around Hartford area. But at the time growing up, that wasn't really a thing. If you wanted to work in these industries, you had to basically move to New York. And so that's what I did. And I'll never forget how overwhelming it felt to look up and see these buildings surrounding you, the hustle and bustle, having to figure out how to get around a place like New York City, whereas in New Haven, your whole life would take place just in a few square blocks that you could just walk. But that move to New York, I think, is a part of growing up and living in Connecticut. It's part of the kind of rite of passage of things. And so it's not that you have to do that. It's that it's so close that it makes it a little easier to make a big jump or change like that in your life than maybe it would be if you're growing up in the middle of Connecticut. So with that, I'm going to answer a few of these questions that have been asked because I see some good ones here. First question is, what are your favorite places in the state? That's a really good question. Certainly, New Haven is one of my favorite places in the state. Um, I do go back to New Haven infrequently. In terms of things to do in Connecticut, um, when we were kids, we would go to a lot of the state parks in Connecticut because there's a lot of nature. I wouldn't call them mountains, but they were hills, lakes, ponds, parks. And when we were kids, that's what we would go and do. We would get together and we would go find a place in nature to hang out. So those were some of the places that I liked. Another question, is Connecticut the smallest state in the US? On the map, it looks like England. It's small, but I don't think it's the smallest. I think Rhode Island is probably the smallest state, but don't quote me on that. Connecticut is pretty small. I mean, I think a lot of these states, New York State is obviously not small, it's massive, but Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts to a lesser degree. I mean, Massachusetts is probably a little bigger than Connecticut, but it's small enough to have everything in the state available to you. You could even be a teenager and go drive all the way to the northwest corner of the state from New Haven and hang out and come back in the same day and not be in trouble with your parents. So you can, and again, as I said, it's such a different, there are tobacco farms and then there is downtown Hartford and manufacturing. And those are, within an hour of each other. So you can travel the whole state pretty easily. The coastline of Connecticut is beautiful. There are towns that go up towards the Rhode Island coast and the Massachusetts coast that are stunning and amazing. There's another question. What's something you appreciated more about Connecticut after leaving? That's funny. It wasn't really until I prepared to do this presentation that I really became grateful for a lot of the aspects that growing up in Connecticut afforded me. One of the most important things was that when I was in high school in West Haven, my social scene took place in New Haven because this is something I always tell people that was really unique to Connecticut and New Haven at the time. In New Haven, the social scene amongst teenagers was not based around one particular high school, like it could be in any other town or even moderate-sized city. We had kids from probably 15 to 20 different high schools, both in and surrounding New Haven and other towns, that all congregated together in one giant scene of kids hanging out together. And as I grew up in life and talked to people from other places, I realized this is really unique to New Haven. And so all of your friends would go to different schools. Like, I didn't really have a lot of friends at my particular high school. Most of my friends went to other schools that I met through this kind of unique social scene in New Haven. So I really appreciate that because that really opened my eyes and changed my life in ways that would not have happened if I had just stayed in West Haven and hadn't been exposed to people that were going to very different types of schools. Another question, how would you describe Connecticut to someone who has never visited? I would say welcoming. I think it's not a state that has an attitude about itself. You'll be welcomed. We don't have there's a thing where you could have like a crusty New Englander, like in Massachusetts. There's a little bit more of a rougher edge sometimes about insider outsiders, but Connecticut's not really like that. Connecticut people are very welcoming and open and happy to see you, particularly if you're traveling from some other country or location. So I think Connecticut is a really open-hearted place that just really kind of lets people be themselves and goes about its business. Another question, what industries are important in Connecticut today? Well, funny enough, a lot of the same ones that have historically been important. Connecticut still has major insurance companies, still has major health companies that are based in Hartford and in other locations. We have a huge aerospace and defense contractor economy in America. We have aviation, which is a huge industry. Sikorsky Helicopters is based in Connecticut. Submarines are made in Connecticut. There's a lot of farming. And academia. I mean, the University of Connecticut is a massive institution in Storrs, Connecticut, and Yale University is a massive institution, and there's a dozen more. And so those industries still thrive, and Connecticut is not a place that is sort of suffering a collapse of the industries that allowed people to live and work there. I think there's a lot of work in Connecticut, and a lot of it remains pretty consistent from what it was when I was growing up. And I think media has crawled into the Fairfield County area in a way where a lot of people that work in my industry and a lot of people who work for my company live in Stamford, Connecticut, and perform all their services there. Here's another. I'm going to jump to this question because I want to make sure that we get to it. What sports teams do people in Connecticut usually support? Excellent question, and I'm so glad that someone asked this because this is a dividing line. Okay, so a lot of times I am a Boston sports fan. I'm a fan of the Red Sox, the Patriots, the Celtics, who unfortunately just lost, the Bruins. And a lot of times when I meet people from other states and they ask me what teams I support, and I mention Massachusetts-based teams, they're surprised. Well, didn't you grow up in Connecticut? And you say, I did, but I grew up in New Haven. I grew up in the southern part of the state. And I would say that New Haven is really a line. Below New Haven, people pretty much support New York City-based sports teams. They are Giants fans, Jets fans, Yankees fans, Mets fans. People that grew up in Hartford or above tend to be Massachusetts sports fans. So this is a big dividing line in Connecticut, and it's a big bone of contention in Connecticut. Now, I just explained to you that I really spent my whole life growing up in the southern part of the state. So how did I end up being a Boston sports fan? I would say I just was gifted with the intelligence to choose more wisely than some of my fellow Connecticut people. What is the coastline and coastal culture like in Connecticut? It's incredible. It's really beautiful. It's surprisingly beautiful. I think that's probably the drive along the Connecticut coastline. It's not beautiful on the roads per se because it's kind of a major highway that gets you there. But all of these towns along the coast of Connecticut, particularly as you get up to the middle part of the state, are quaint, adorable New England seaside towns and villages. And the culture is huge boating, a lot of fishing, and that access that I mentioned to New York kind of being accessible by train. Well, a lot of people that live in the middle part of the state on the coast have accessible to them by just an average powerboat, places like Block Island, Rhode Island, Long Island, the beaches that exist out in the Atlantic Ocean. And so that whole world, that kind of expands the whole aspect of living on the coast. So the coastal part of Connecticut is its own thing, and can be very wild in the best sense of nature being right at your front door, literally. Let's see. Do any of your favorite films take place in Connecticut? Good question. Well, let's see. What's the most famous film to take place in Connecticut? I would say it probably still is the film Mystic Pizza. There is a town in Connecticut called Mystic, Connecticut. It's one of those seaside towns that I mentioned. Pretty sure they shot the film there. I'm pretty sure the pizza place is still there. I can't think if any other films really take place. There's a film that I love that's called Chameleon Street, and it's by an independent filmmaker who spent some time in New Haven, and it has many scenes that take place in New Haven. And I believe they shot some exterior scenes of this in New Haven in the early 90s. It's part of the American independent cinema movement. It's well worth checking out. It's been released on a Criterion DVD. So those are a couple of Connecticut-based films. Are there any chain restaurants that Connecticut has? Yeah, we have all the chain restaurants. There's a place in Connecticut called the Post Road, which is a very American agglomeration of fast food restaurants, chain restaurants, supermarkets. I mean, you could drive this for really the entirety of Connecticut and see a lot of the same restaurants over and over. What type of pizza do you like and recommend? Well, as I said, I recommend modern pizza. We call it Abitz, Pizza, a pizza, but you say abits, modern abits. That's the type of pizza I like and recommend. It is a charred crust, a slightly sweet tomato sauce. It's cooked in an incredibly hot oven for an incredibly short amount of time and brought to you fresh. Get the bacon and garlic and get a pitcher of birch beer. You will not regret it. Okay, let's see. If a friend were visiting Connecticut for the first time, where would you take them? Well, I'd take them to New Haven, and I would get them some pizza, and I would get them a hamburger at Louis' lunch, and I would make them go to all the places that I lived and all the things that I did. And if they didn't like it, too bad. You mentioned getting together with people outside of your high school, but what role did community play in your upbringing? Well, I would say it played a big role, both positive and negative. Positive in the sense that I was the only child of a single mother. And so I needed a lot of babysitting growing up. That's community. That's people in the community who are pulling together and helping to raise a child. West Haven in particular was not a great community at the time that I was living there. And that would be a more detrimental part of how community played a role. But in New Haven, the community played a tremendous role because it was kind of like living in a starter city where you're kind of in a city, but it's not so dwarfing like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. And so being a part of the community is pretty easy. Like if you live and work in New Haven, within a week, you're going to recognize people on the street. You're going to have your favorite coffee shop, your favorite lunch place, your favorite place to, buy books or buy bread. You're going to recognize people and they're going to recognize you. So you're kind of immediately a part of a community in a way that is kind of great, because when you move to New York, that sense that it's so massive here, it's so dwarfingly huge, kind of goes away once you realize that in your neighborhood in New York City, like right now I'm in the West Village, well, that's a community. I see the same people on the street all the time. It's not really any different than New Haven. This is my community. And if I lived in the East Village, which I did when I moved here, that's a different community. So those communities, I think, shape us in ways that we're not fully aware of all the time, but do play a big part in how we grow up. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to thank you for joining us. This program is part of the American Center in Moscow's weekly speaker series, which continues through the year. It's about the 50 states, and we invite you to join us next time, which is next Wednesday, May 13th, 8 p.m. Moscow time, for the next event in this series, which will be about the state of Iowa. Very different than Connecticut. I hope you'll understand. Thank you so much for being a part today.